Okay, we'll see then. But yeah, so generally we're open to the Middle East now and North Africa to discuss more about Iraq, but also the region in general.
Right.
So yeah, maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit just for the people not knowing you that much, maybe in France, or people that knows you and wants to know more about you.
Sure. My name's Gregory Gause. I just retired earlier this year from a position at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. I am currently a visiting scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I've had a career that's focused on the politics of the Middle East, particularly the politics of the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf region. Also studying American policy in the region, and published 3 books and a number of articles on these topics. So that's who I am.
That is an amazing background. The Middle East Institute, I do follow a lot of their activities. So that's pretty much how I discovered you before reaching out to you. So yeah. So now let's talk now about the US and Iran relation. To do like a little brief, the US and Iranian relation always had been between cold and warm relation with Reza Shah, then there was Ayatollah Khomeini, then there was like the embassy incident with the hostage and so on. Then so the relation was going very, very dark. But then they came back into trying to talk more with Iran because Iran is one of the main influenced country in the Middle East. We've seen it with its proxies, with the militias, Hezbollah, for instance. The Alawite was Bashar Assad before the fall of the regime. The Houthis was Yemen. So Iran played a huge role, and that's why also the US tried to be close to Iran at some point. We've seen with the JCPOA agreement in 2015. Then there was another one in 2018. Even though it was kind of positive, there has a lot of setbacks and drawbacks from Iran, but also the US. And we've seen also the tense relationship between Iran and the US allies like Saudi Arabia, Israel, and so on. So now that October 7th, 2023 happened, Iran was at the forefront. Iran was one of the main countries to try to fight Israel as much as it could. But then we've seen how it drew back because it was kind of also destroyed or at least reduced by Israel. We've seen it with Hezbollah. We've seen it also with how they attacked the Iranian territory in itself in Tehran, and they were able to kill also some of the main leaders of Hamas there. So Iran tried to focus more on itself. We've seen a lot of complicated situation with the regime. We don't know who's going to replace the Ayatollah Khamenei, who's very sick, but also how the Pasdaran are going to be a bit more stronger and gain legitimacy. We've seen also the interior policy in Iran is kind of, the society is kind of divided with the situation with women, the situation with the religion, and so on, the economic situation also. So Iran is trying to work harder on itself than now on its proxies. And the US, we've seen now that Donald Trump, in his first terms, was a bit more like anti-Iran, and if we can put it in general. And now, in his second term, we've seen that he has changed his posture, something that no one could have predicted at some point. He's becoming more vocal into finding a solution with Iran, mainly with the nuclear agreement. And also, Donald Trump is going against Benjamin Netanyahu's ideas. So it's kind of a division not only with Benjamin Netanyahu, but also showing that the US is willing to talk more with Iran. So after this overall reviews of the situation, my first question is, in what ways has the maximum pressure campaign affected Iran's economic resilience and diplomatic strategies?
So we certainly know maximum pressure affected Iran's ability to export oil. We know that maximum pressure severely affected its ability to conduct economic relations, even with third countries. And this, I think, was the most important thing, and probably the thing that people didn't anticipate about maximum pressure during the first Trump administration was that China was basically unwilling to deal with Iran because it feared being closed out of American markets. Now, that was back in 2018 when Trump left the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and it was the policy failed, right? The maximum pressure policy basically failed in that the Trump people thought it would either lead to the collapse of the regime or a willingness of the regime to negotiate from a position of weakness. And that didn't happen. In fact, what we saw was the Iranian regime conducting a series of attacks in order to try to break the maximum pressure policy, the most important of which, the culmination of which, was the attack on the Saudi oil facilities in September 2019. And I think the Saudis were quite shocked when the United States did not respond. So you had this Trump administration policy in the first term where he was very intent on pressuring Iran, to some extent at the behest and the encouragement of the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu, but not willing to use American military force for what, for decades, the United States said it was in the Persian Gulf for, which was to assure the free flow of oil. Because the Iranian attack on the Saudi oil facilities in 2019 was really the biggest attack on the free flow of oil since Saddam Hussein set the Kuwaiti oil fields on fire back in 1991. So it was quite shocking to the Saudis that the United States didn't respond. Then you had the Biden administration come in, and it was very much the Biden administration, which was in many ways a continuation of the Obama administration, did try to restore the nuclear deal with Iran, but there was incompatibility on both sides. The Biden administration wanted a kind of longer and stronger deal. The Iranians were in the midst of personnel changes, a new president, and it just didn't come together. Recall that this is also the time of COVID, which I think had an enormous effect on policy making throughout the world, and really, it didn't help push the U.S. and Iran together. I think it helped keep them apart. When the Russians invaded Ukraine, the Biden administration was very concerned about the price of oil. And thus, even though there were sanctions, U.S. sanctions on Iran, it didn't enforce those sanctions, and Iran was able, without renewing a nuclear deal, Iran was able to basically rejoin the world oil market. And that also reduced the incentives for the Iranians to make a deal. So then Donald Trump comes back in. And as you said, it was anticipated that he would return to a maximum pressure policy. And every once in a while, he would talk as if he were doing that. And he appointed a number of people in his new administration that had been very critical of Iran. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, the National Security Advisor, Michael Walls. And many of us anticipated we would see a return to confrontation. But Trump is also a deal maker. He fancies himself the best deal maker in the world. And seeing that Iran was weakened as a result of the Gaza war, for all the reasons that you said, its proxies and allies, Hezbollah, Hamas, were severely weakened. The Assad regime was overthrown. The only one of its proxies that seemed to emerge from the Gaza war, somewhat strengthened, were the Houthis. But the Houthis are pretty marginal and pretty far away, right? Trump thought that this was a time for a deal with Iran. And the fact that you had a new president in Iran, President Pezeshkian, who seem to be more than willing to re-engage in negotiations on the nuclear question, and perhaps even beyond that, it opened up the possibility. Now, that's where we are now. But as the world knows, President Trump is not afraid to turn his policy around suddenly. And the thing I worry about the most in this is that President Trump looks for quick victories. We see this in Gaza, right? He came in saying he would end the war in Gaza in a day. Well, the negotiations were more difficult, and so what happened? He kind of walked away from them. And he's given the Iranians a very short timeline for a deal. Now, we know he's reluctant to engage in military force, right? We saw that in his first term. But he has threatened military force against the Iranians if they don't return to some kind of nuclear agreement that would either severely limit their enrichment capacity or eliminate it. That's one of the uncertainties in the American position, which we can get into. But so it's a time of opportunity, but also great uncertainty, I think, in Iranian-American relations.
More about how do current U.S. domestic politics and congressional actions shape the trajectory of U.S.-Iran relations? We talk about how his government were more anti-Iranian. So how this current U.S. domestic politics and government is helping Donald Trump into finding a quicker solution with Iran?
Domestic politics is still tilted very much toward a pro-Israel position. This is particularly true in Congress. And you won't find any friends of Iran in Congress, that's for sure. However, I think President Trump's position in the Republican Party is so strong that if he were to be able to achieve some kind of deal with Iran, I don't think he'll have much problem getting it through Congress. I think that there would be enough Republicans who would follow him because he's their leader or they fear his opposition. And then the Democrats are more inclined to agreements with Iran on the nuclear issue. We saw that with it was originally negotiated, of course, by the Obama administration. So I don't think domestic politics are going to be an obstacle if President Trump can get what he wants in an Iran deal. I think the big question for the administration is what exactly do they want? I think it would be relatively easy to get a deal that would be similar to what the Obama administration got. Pretty severe limitations on Iranian enrichment, international inspections, and an effort to kind of push Iran away from the ability to weaponize. However, if the administration wants to go further than that, the administration, as it's sometimes indicated, wants to deny Iran the ability to enrich uranium at all, which is actually a right guaranteed to countries who are signatories of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran is. And if the administration wants to push the Iranians on other questions, support for the Houthis, the Iranian missile capabilities. If the administration wanted to push the Iranians on those questions, it would be more difficult to get to an agreement. And then you're in the situation where if the agreement doesn't come fast, does President Trump reverse himself and go back to maximum pressure and the threat of military action at a time when the Israelis, and this has been reported on in the press, when the Israelis and the Netanyahu government came to Trump early on, a couple of months ago, early on in his administration, and said, now is the time for a military strike on Iran because they're weaker. They're weaker as a result of the Israeli military strikes back in 2024. So this is a very unpredictable president. And I'm not confident saying that he's going to go an agreement direction or he's going to go a return to maximum pressure and potentially military strikes. I think that there's about an equal chance of each.
Yeah, only times will tell when it comes to Donald Trump. We can't always predict whatever he's going to do. We've seen it many times.
It's very difficult to predict Donald Trump.
I agree for that. So my other question is more related to previous negotiations, to talk more about the ongoing ones. How have previous negotiation failures informed Iran's current approach to international diplomacy and nuclear discussions?
So I think there's two important factors here. One is that the Iranians have already in the past agreed to limitations on their nuclear capacities, right? So that's not something that they will have to fight out within their own domestic politics. There's a precedent for that. If they can get a deal that they can live with, I don't think that the Revolutionary Guard would veto these things. And Khamenei has been pretty clear, giving Pezeshkian the go-ahead to negotiate. So I don't think that there's a serious domestic problem for Iran. Two is that Iran is in a much weaker position than it was when it signed the JCPOA with the Obama administration in 2015. In 2015, it had a very strong regional position. Economically, it was suffering because of not just American sanctions, but there were UN sanctions, and joined by both Russia and China. Russia and China are much more willing to ignore sanctions and deal with Iran now, the Russians particularly, but the Chinese also. They're buying Iranian oil. But Iran's regional position is much weaker, right, as we just discussed. And I think there might be in the new government in Iran, the Pezeshkian government, a willingness to draw back a bit from its regional position, the commitment of its resources, which proved to be, for the most part, ended in failure in Lebanon and in Palestine and in Syria. There might be a willingness to draw back from that a bit, and perhaps informally in a negotiation with the United States, say, look, we're gonna be much more modest in our regional ambitions. And there might be an indication of that in the deal that the United States and the Houthis made. Because of course this deal, which was a bilateral ceasefire that seems to be holding between the Houthis and the US, not the Houthis in Israel. The Houthis are still firing missiles up at Israel, but between the Houthis and the US, I would assume that the Iranians encouraged the Houthis to make that agreement. And that might be an indication that the Iranians are willing to negotiate not just about the nuclear issue, but also about other regional issues.
Thank you for this answer. Iran, yeah. And so we're talking about regional actors. So how might regional actors such as Israel and also the Gulf countries, for instance, influence or hinder efforts toward US-Iran de-escalation? In regard of Oman, Oman is the mediator. So how does this behavior affect or help the US-Iranian relation?
So there's a big change from the situation during the first Trump administration to now. During the first Trump administration, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which, as we can see, Mr. Trump has a close relationship with, a financial relationship, both country to country and also personally. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates very much encouraged the maximum pressure policy, right up until the attacks in 2019. But those attacks, I think, had an enormous impact on Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, in that both of them began to question the reliability of the American military commitment. And both of them tried to reach out to Iran to have a less conflictual relationship, a less tense relationship. I don't want to say that they're trying to be allies with Iran. They still both see Iran as threatening and as dangerous. But instead of a direct confrontation, they've pursued a policy of engagement to try to lessen the threat. And of course, with Iran weaker in the region, I think that they see Iran as somewhat less threatening than they would have 7 or 8 years ago. And thus, both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates encouraged the Trump administration to continue the negotiations with Iran, right? The Saudi line, and the Saudis are the most important player here. The Saudi line is we're concentrating completely on economic development. We're concentrating completely on the realization of Vision 2030, the grand plan for a post-oil economy. And that requires regional peace and stability. And so the Saudis, rather than pushing for a strong policy against Iran, are pushing or supporting Mr. Trump's inclination for negotiations. So there's that. The Israelis are on the opposite side, obviously. The Netanyahu government sees Iran not only as a major threat, despite its weakened position, but also the Netanyahu government, for its own political reasons in domestic Israeli politics, has an interest in maintaining an idea that Israel is constantly at war. Because the failures of the Netanyahu government to anticipate the October 7th, 2023 attacks from Hamas, plus the corruption charges against Netanyahu personally, all of these things kind of combine to put Netanyahu in a position that if he loses the prime ministership, he's in big trouble, perhaps even in serious legal trouble. And thus, maintaining a sense of constant crisis and conflict is in his personal political interests. And, you know, the Israelis were very successful in taking out Iranian nuclear, or not Iranian nuclear, but Iranian air defense facilities around the nuclear sites during the attacks in 2024. And thus, the Israelis see a window of opportunity to strike at Iran, but they want American support in that. And I think they would need American support for a successful military strike. And there, the Trump administration is not, at least at this point, cooperating. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the gap between the Israelis and the Americans, right? It would be a mistake to see this as a big crisis that is going to lead to some complete reevaluation of the American-Israeli relationship. I mean, look at Gaza. Yes, the Trump administration perhaps disagrees with Netanyahu's current offensive in Gaza, but it's not doing anything about it, right? There's a difference between an American president saying, I'm not pleased with what the Israelis are doing, and I'm going to put a lot of pressure on Israel to reverse its course. And a president who says, I don't like what the Israelis are doing, I'm going to walk away from this problem, which basically gives the Israelis carte blanche to do what they want. And it appears that's what the Trump administration is doing on Gaza. Okay, so it would be a mistake to exaggerate the sense of crisis or division between Israel and the U.S., but clearly on Iran, there's tensions. But the bottom line is Netanyahu doesn't have much leverage on Trump. Trump thinks he has leverage on Netanyahu. And so, as I said, Trump could wake up tomorrow and say, these Iranians, we can't trust them. This negotiation is going nowhere. Maximum pressure, military threats. And Netanyahu would be very supportive. But Trump will do that not because of pressure from Netanyahu, but because he wakes up one morning and just decides he has to change things.
So my other question is more talking about the JCPOA agreements to the 2015 and 2018. Possibly we'll go to another one in 2025, who knows? So what are the primary barriers to reviving the JCPOA agreement in the current US-Iran diplomatic climate? Even though we've seen that they're in a discussion mode, we cannot forget that they were two main rivals for a long time. So how can we work more toward that into making sure that the JCPOA agreement can appears and can succeed?
So I think the big issue, as I mentioned before, is the issue of enrichment. I'm no physicist, so I don't want to pretend that I know the details, the scientific details on this, but the political issues are pretty clear. Under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, countries are allowed to enrich uranium up to a small percentage of purity. I forget whether it's 3.9, 4.4, whatever. This is far below the level necessary for weapons grade materials. The Iranians have publicly stated that they will not give up the right to enrich under that very minimal level. At times, the Trump administration has said their policy is complete ban on any enrichment of uranium in Iran. At other times, people in the Trump administration have said, well, you know, these very low levels, that they're fine. We can live with that. We just don't know whether that's going to be, as we say in English, a deal breaker or not. So that's the major issue. It seems to me that the other elements, international inspections, the Iranians agreed to that under the International Atomic Energy Agency back in the original JCPOA. I don't think they'd have problems with that. Now we can argue, are they hiding things? Are they completely honest with the inspectors? But the principle of inspections doesn't seem to be problematic for the Iranians. So I think the big issue here is enrichment. And then we get to the other set of other issues. The success of the original JCPOA was that it was limited simply to the nuclear question. And one of the things that the Obama administration was criticized for is that it didn't include Iranian involvement in the region, Iranian proxies, Iranian missiles, the whole range of issues. And the Obama people, I think, very accurately said, if you put those on the table, the Iranians aren't going to agree. And what we wanted to do was get them in an agreement to walk back their nuclear capability. It's not clear whether the Iranians would be willing to put these other regional issues on the table, or whether the Americans would insist that there be some Iranian concessions on support for proxies and allies in the regions or on their missile capability. That's another big issue. Is the new round of nuclear negotiations purely on the nuclear question, or does it include these other
Yes, I think it was this weekend. There was the disarmament of Hezbollah. There was the announcement that, if I'm not mistaken, I have seen something related to Hezbollah, so maybe it is related to the disarmament. And there's also the discussion over the disarmament in the end of Hamas too. So
Yes.
do you think that these two main proxies of Iran might show more of Iranian clemencies into respecting some of the conditions to make the JCPOA agreement happening and working?
So I don't think that Hamas is in a position to show much flexibility. The Israelis are clearly on a mission to destroy it completely. I don't know if I doubt very strongly that can be done as a political force, but they're not in a negotiating position right now. Hezbollah is a more interesting question. Hezbollah is the most powerful actor in Lebanese politics, but it has been weakened. And the fall of the Assad regime means it's just going to be so much harder for the Iranians to bolster Hezbollah's military supplies. It seems like it's a time in Lebanese politics where there's more pressure than there's been in decades on Hezbollah to actually give up their arms in a practical way, the way that many of the other Lebanese militias did at the end of the Civil War. Now, One of the complicating factors here is that the Israelis have occupied territory inside Lebanon as a result of their campaign against Hezbollah. It's a very successful campaign against Hezbollah. That is part and parcel of the overall Gaza war. Hezbollah's argument for why they should keep their weapons since 2000 has been, we are conducting a national liberation campaign for Lebanon against Israel because the Israelis are holding little bits of Lebanese territory. This was a pretext, obviously. I mean, Hezbollah was holding onto its weapons because it made it the most powerful actor in Lebanese politics. But the Israelis are providing a pretext. They're providing an excuse for Hezbollah to say, we can't give up our weapons. Look, the Israelis are now occupying even more of our territory. And I think that a smart American administration would pressure the Israelis on this question, because if you're going to get Hezbollah to really disarm, you want to reduce whatever.
Lebanon has the territory where if something is happening in Syria, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon is going to be affected for sure by it. We've seen it with the civil war. We've seen in 1975 for 15 years with the Syrian occupation. We've seen Israel attacking the south of Lebanon because of the Palestinian forces there. And then Hezbollah happened in 1982. So then there's another reason to attack the southern part of Lebanon. So Lebanon has been by itself, maybe out of not some good luck, the theater of a lot of chaotic events in the Middle East. And so seeing that Hezbollah now, it has to compile to some rules to disarm themselves, but still being involved in Lebanese politics, but under some restrictions, not as before, is something that a lot of people now are taking into consideration and looking at. And I'm also following the news on that because it's like historical. So we'll see what is going to happen. And so my last question for you is maybe relate to how unexpected Donald Trump is, but what leverage does the US currently now today, after all the discussion in Oman and so on, have in coaxing Iran back to the negotiating table without military escalation? Iran, US, we've seen the relation. Iran sometimes used military expedition to show its strengths and to show that they're here. We've seen it in 2019, we've seen it in 2024 in Israel and so on. So how can the US make sure that this time, or even Iran makes this time, the condition happens that no military escalation will happen? So
I think that there are two things that make the prospect of a US-Iranian deal more likely. One is the fact that Iran not only is weaker in the region, but feels itself to be weaker, right? You have a president in Iran who came into office saying, we have to concentrate on establishing better relations in the world in order for us to concentrate on our economic problems. And this is a product not just of American sanctions or of the setbacks that they've suffered as a result of the Gaza war in Syria, in Lebanon, and Palestine. But it's also a result of the fact that we've seen, significant demonstrations within Iran in the post-COVID period. The Women, Peace, and Freedom movement, brought hundreds of thousands of people into the streets and kind of represented a rejection of the social policies of the regime. So the regime is criticized on its economic policies, on its social policies, and now on its foreign policy. And thus Iran, I think, is in a position where it wants to readjust. It doesn't want to change completely. Look, we shouldn't exaggerate the weakness of Iran's position. It's still the most influential country in Iraq. It still has strong relations with a number of important non-state actors, weakened non-state actors perhaps like Hezbollah, but still, able to create problems in the region. But Iran, I think, is in a position where it wants to deal. And it sees an American president who wants to deal, but is extremely slippery on what that deal should be. And I think that's why this is a period of optimism for the possibility of an agreement, but also a period of uncertainty, because it's just not clear what exactly it is the United States, or specifically Mr. Trump himself, is willing to accept as part of the deal.